Surely the wrath of man shall praise thee, the remainder of wrath shalt thou restrain. Did the Puritans plant the seeds of the American Revolution? The evidence demonstrates that the spread of Puritan ideology was deliberate. Indeed, respected historian Edmund Morgan noted that insofar as the American Revolution, patriotism and the Puritan ethic marched hand in hand from 1764 to 1789. The Puritans founded the oldest Presbyterian church in America, First Presbyterian Church of Southampton, New York. In fact, the Puritans founded several of the oldest Presbyterian churches on the east end of Long Island, including the churches of Southampton in 1640, Southold in 1640, and East Hampton in 1648. These settlements were intended to buttress the Dutch colony in New York and to mission to Native Americans. Massachusetts Bay Governor John Winthrop was linked to the planting of these new towns, which was a distinctive feature of New England. The settlers of East Hampton, Southampton, and Southold were largely Puritans from New England. Charles Craven described the process as planting of Puritan towns. These towns were later referred to as Yankee towns, which rivalry between the Anglican and Presbyterian churches were latent as were relations between the Dutch and the English.
So the First Presbyterian Church of Southampton was founded in 1640. It was founded at the same time as the first English settlement in the state of New York. It was settled by a group of Puritans coming from Lynn, Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Having tried to settle in Oyster Bay, Long Island in March and kicked out by the Dutch, they headed further out east to a tract of land that they had been granted by a land claim from the Earl of Stirling, a Scotsman that was friends of King James. And so they started a town and a church and a settlement here in 1640. And the town and the church and its inhabitants were one at that time. Yeah.
The church structure in Southampton would have been a small and unassuming structure. These artists' renderings depict how it likely would have looked. The First Presbyterian Church of Southold was founded in 1640 as the First Church of Christ in Southold, under the leadership of the Reverend John Youngs from Southold, England. Reverend Youngs is buried in the church cemetery, and the headstone was recently reconstructed by the Southold congregation. Notably, stained glass windows inside the church office depict the Puritan foundings of the church, as well as a gift made in 1980 from St. Edmund's Church of Southold, England, which Reverend Youngs was associated with. A history board is framed in the Southold church office, tracing its history, including artist renderings of the ship and the Puritan landings at Southold. While there are no known renderings of the church house, it also would have likely been a small structure. Similarly, the church building at East Hampton would have been a structure small in stature, similar to the other churches.
So we were founded in 1648 by colonists who came over the little stretch of water there from Connecticut. And these were Puritans who wanted to start a new congregation where they had been given land for farming and where they were, settling for the indefinite future.
Do you think you can see some kind of connection between this church and the Puritan foundation, or not foundation, but Puritan settlements?
Absolutely. They had close connections with the Massachusetts Bay Colony for the first 100 years or so of their existence, and even after the American Revolution, it's still in the DNA today.
One of the authors that I've been reading about called it Yankee towns, as a settlement of kind of New England transplanted to Long Island.
I would agree. I think if you go through the East End, what we call the Hamptons, even today, the architecture, the cultural, a lot of the institutions that survived into the modern era started with the Puritans, and they never really gave it up.
Research supports links between the Puritans and Presbyterians to the American Revolution. In A History of New York State, David Ellis notes that these Yankee churches would later drift toward a more centralized form of organized Presbyterianism. Similarly, in the Empire State, A History of New York, Milton Kline noted that the Congregational churches on Long Island continued joining the burgeoning presbytery. He indicated that these congregations were generally of New England heritage. Obviously, as the population grew, the size of the churches, along with the Suffolk Presbytery, followed on Long Island. As the 18th century progressed, these former Puritan churches became denominational. In fact, according to a brief history of the First Presbyterian Church of East Hampton from 1648 to 1998, the East Hampton Church became Presbyterian in 1745, and Puritan influence became a permanent feature of American Presbyterianism, causing it to be significantly different in some ways from the established church in Scotland. In other words, as is in the case of the original Puritan churches, the Presbyterian Church in America was a dissenting church from the established churches. Professor John Stout wrote, Presbyterian support of the Revolution was fostered by the fear that the British government was trying to increase authority of the Church of England by creating an American episcopate, the jurisdiction of an Anglican bishop in America. Presbyterians saw the supposed establishment of an American episcopate as part of a plot to create an exclusive and monopolistic Anglican establishment.
Do you think that that was in part because the Suffolk County churches were Puritan-based?
They were Puritan-based, but by the time of the Second Great Awakening, and definitely by the time of the American Revolution, the presbytery itself was more dominant than any congregation or anything like that. It had a strong network of control and leadership in the Presbyterian Church on Long Island.
Joseph Tiedemann has provided a table estimating British troops at over 8,000 during periods of time during the American Revolution. Professor Stout agrees with Tiedemann's estimates.
What was the longest militarily occupied area of the colonies during the Revolution?
It would be Long Island. The Battle of Long Island, or the Battle of Brooklyn as it's sometimes called, happened in August of 1776. And the last British troops to leave America at the end of the American Revolution was December 4th, 1783, from what is now the Hampton Harbor.
So during that time, the island was a base?
The island was a base of operations for the military, the British military.
And can you give an estimate of how they were spread out on Long Island?
It ebbed and flowed. Sometimes there were 10,000 troops in places like Huntington, and sometimes there was only a few regiments of troops throughout the entire island. So it really kind of depended on what you're talking about in regards to the year, the month. There were troops in Oyster Bay at times headquartered there. There were troops in Huntington, East Hampton, Fort St. George. There were forts throughout the war on Long Island, going from Brooklyn all the way out to the East End. And up in Smithtown, what is today called Fort Salongo, was called Fort Songo, which was a British officer who had a fort on the North Shore. So there were 8 or 9 forts throughout Long Island. But the number of troops, as I said, fluctuated throughout the course of the war.
Thomas C. Pears, former secretary of the Presbyterian Historical Society, argued that Presbyterians ecclesiastically dominated the colonies for several reasons, including large numbers, uniform and widespread distribution of population, unanimity of thought, intercolonial presence, and remarkable leadership. In fact, almost implying that Presbyterian was predestined to lead the American Revolution, Pears stated that no other denomination in the colonial period had been conditioned by its historical development in any comparable role for this particular task. Richard Gardner argued that scholarship on the American Revolution routinely underrepresents the role of religion. In fact, he noted that in the minds of the king, the English authorities, and American loyalists, the American Revolution was fundamentally, at bottom, a Presbyterian rebellion. Leonard Kramer characterized Presbyterian support of the American cause as almost unanimous. He underscores the point by noting that the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence was Presbyterian minister John Witherspoon of New Jersey. Again, returning to Dr. Stout, he coined the apt term to describe the activities of Long Islanders, including Presbyterians, during the Revolution as resistance. From their pulpits, Presbyterian ministers provided vital information and the moral encouragement necessary to sustain the Whig mobilization.
The activities you're describing, this kind of resistance, was the Presbyterian Church involved in that kind of activity?
Not only was it just, military resistance, it was moral resistance as well. And the Presbyterian Church was extremely important in regards to lending the moral support for the Continental Congress and for the American independence.
The church obviously was active during the American Revolutionary times. Can you describe some of the activities or stories maybe that have been passed down about the church during that time?
So the minister during the Revolution was a man by the name of Sylvanus White, and he happens still to be the longest serving pastor of this congregation's 384-year history. He was the minister here for 55 years. And so he had been the minister here for a long time by the time, I think 40 years by the time the American Revolutionary came. So there was a really steady hand within the community, and it helped provide sort of a steadiness to this community, I think, through really volatile times. The area was one of great sympathy towards the cause for independence, for the Revolution and the new Republic, and it was a difficult time. I gather that most of the young men were gone, either fled to fight or fled into Connecticut, and the farms were being run by women, and slaves were left to work the fields. And the British had a very large occupation here in Southampton. There were a lot of British during the war here. The story that has gone down through the most commonly known story of the church is that there were some small cannons that were saved by the church and used as weights, apparently, in the church clock or a bell or something, and hidden from the British in the bell tower. And they were never discovered by any Tory sympathizers, of which there were clearly a few in the area, or the British, even though there was such a large contingent here. So I think the church weathered a very difficult time here during the Revolution, but because of leadership and goodwill in the community towards a difficult time, I think that they came through it fairly well.
In Southold, the pastor of the church, John Storrs, along with the pastor from the South Haven Church, David Rose, were forced to flee to Connecticut. Notably, according to the Southold town website, from 1776 until the war ended in 1783, the British occupied Southold with about 500 infantry and 50 cavalry on and off for a total of 7 years.
And that kind of religious activism, do you think that carried forward towards later colonial times?
Yes, certainly. They definitely saw themselves as Puritans first from the founding, and only later adopted Presbyterianism as a means to continue their Puritan way of theology and ecclesiology and all that came with it.
There's been some reports or some stories about this church's activism during the American Revolution. Can you describe that a little?
Sure. So the way the story is told around here, Samuel Buell, who was the pastor at the time, was an American, a patriot first and foremost, but in order to ensure his own survival and the survival of his people, did allow the English soldiers and the English government to do what they needed to do, but the moment they could be American, that was his way forward.
Do you think that the church was reflected, patriot ideals at that time? Or?
I think so, certainly. And even theologically, they were much more in line with this American brand of evangelicalism or new light, old light. I mean, you could really get into it, but they were very much a congregation that was theologically apart from the Church of England.
So would you consider them more new light or old light at that time?
Oh, new light, certainly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you think that the efforts or the activism of the East Hampton congregation reflected the larger efforts of American Presbyterianism during the Revolution?
I think so. I think that they certainly saw themselves as uniquely American and not super interested in, continuing anything that they brought from Europe or England specifically. I believe that their identity in this town specifically was quite strong as an American church. And this is evidenced by the fact that there was no Church of England, or really Episcopal Church, for some maybe 100 years after the founding. They were the only church.
And do you think that spirit is carried forward to modern history?
Yes, certainly my people like to think of themselves as Puritans, even at the expense of being Presbyterians at times.
In what is considered one of the most influential sermons before the Revolution, Presbyterian Reverend John Witherspoon presented a sermon on May 17, 1776, titled "The Dominion of Providence over the Passions of Men," based on Psalm 76:10, which was a principal sermon inspiring the Declaration of Independence that Witherspoon himself signed. Based on the evidence that Presbyterians across the colonies led the American Revolution, we can envision similar sermons on Long Island challenging congregants to active resistance of the British. "Surely the wrath of man shall praise thee, the remainder of wrath shalt thou restrain." From their earliest founding to their contemporary service, each of these three historic churches is still in active existence, demonstrating their remarkable resilience throughout their history, including their growth and resistance during the American Revolutionary War. To God be the glory. Thank you for watching.